non-humans and wherever the hell you think you are or might be. This is now ZQ287 Kill the Future. The future needs dying again, part 2. And I want to just make sure we get through this quickly. Today we are going to pose 3 questions to a room full of very opinionated people, and hopefully we have the audacity to share it with you. So with that said, I'm going to introduce our people as it is labeled here on this laptop. Talia Molay is an activist, artist, and poetessa dedicated to mothering revolutions. Stephen T. Bramble is a novelist and co-founder of ZQ287. Michael Brown is an independent socialist and activist organizer based in Long Beach. And Dustin Garcia is a cartoonist and educator. And I myself is your friendly neighborhood supervillain, Alan St. Clark, co-founder of ZQ287. Everyone, say hello.
All right.
Hello. Excellent.
Hello.
Hello.
So, as that being said, again, I'm going to pose our first question to our room full of very intelligent human beings. First question is, over the last 5 years, the far right managed to seize the highest levers of U.S. power with the election of Trump. This added legitimacy and firepower to an already existing global trend of unbased, ethnonationalism and authoritarianism. However, the last 5 years also witnessed mass uprisings in every region of the world against components of neoliberalism, or even in some cases, the system in its entirety. The agenda of the far left also broke through into the mainstream. Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren established themselves as leaders of a progressive wing, backed up by a growing cadre of state officials and members of Congress. Given these developments, what do you think is the state of the far left in American politics? So I'm going to pose this question first. This is going to go to the far end, to Michael Brown. Mr. Brown.
All right, cool. So first things first, Alan, thanks so much for welcoming me on your platform. I'm not as familiar with it. Stephen's given me a little background info and some tidbits of information as well in terms of kind of what to expect here. So I was told it was pretty much a freewheeling conversation. So, I'll oblige and go in that direction. But good opening question. It's hard to sum it up, succinctly, because I think it's a lot of layers to it. But I guess the first thing I would say is in terms of, characterizing the far left in this country and globally, especially globally, I think it's important to understand that, first off, people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, despite some of their populist rhetoric, they're still within the framework of the Democratic Party, which is a party that's wholly controlled by Wall Street and the military industrial complex. So I actually wouldn't classify them as quote unquote far left. I point that out because I think it's important to call things what they are and to understand things what they are. But with that said, it's still important to acknowledge that they are part of a rising sort of populist left that has been, on the ascension in this country. Ever since the Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, Fight for 15, these different social movements that have kind of, prepared the ground for, some of the populist wins we've seen by people like AOC and Bernie Sanders and, even to an extent, Elizabeth Warren, although I don't count her as any part of the left. Just in terms of the state of the left in this country right now, I was really heartened by what I saw this past summer, with the George Floyd rebellion, and some of the insurrectionary activity we saw all throughout this country. Unfortunately, it was episodic. It didn't sustain itself. And, unfortunately, just in my opinion, many of the activists resigned themselves to, Democratic Party politics and getting Joe Biden, a neoliberal elected, so unfortunately that energy wasn't able to sustain itself because I think the level of organization in this country right now on the left, not just in terms of organizations, but also in terms of labor unions, is very weak. In fact, it's at one of its weakest points, of the past 50 years, particularly in the context of this neoliberal era. So I think there's a lot of things to point to that are promising. We did see a lot of wildcat strikes at the top of this COVID pandemic. That, for people who are not familiar, those are illegal work actions taken by people like teachers and also essential workers in a lot of fields. So you can usually gauge the health of the left in this country by where labor unions are in the state of the labor movement. But unfortunately, right now in this country, the labor movement is very strong. I mean, very weak. And that's due to, a half century of red baiting, McCarthyism, and also the fact that the union bureaucracy is in bed with the Democratic Party, which is an enemy entity to the working class in this country. So not to be a Debbie Downer or anything, like I said, I think there are some kindlings of struggle, that give me a lot of hope. Again, like what we saw this past summer and some of the labor actions. But right now, I'd say overall, the left in this country is fairly weak. And the fact that, most of the activist left fell in line behind Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who are not promising to do anything for us, is indicative of that.
Thank you. Oh, this is a great place to start. And then I'm going to now send that same question to Talia. Can't hear you.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. Can
Excellent.
you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, somehow this changed on me. Sorry. Yeah, this idea. Oh, well, I also too, like Michael, want to thank Alan and Steve for inviting me to this chat, and I'm looking forward to engaging in conversation. As far as the far left is concerned, the way that I see it in this country really is not necessarily as this within the government type of thing. For me, the far left is actually represented in grassroots movements, in movements itself. And I think that I agree when Michael was saying that, Elizabeth Warren is not a progressive, Bernie Sanders, Biden, in the media presenting Biden as like liberal. Yeah, I mean, no. Those of us that are in the know understand how politics has been, how the media has worked these people. And made them seem as though they are actually somewhat progressive, and they're not. And I think that probably the most progressive of all within the government would be Bernie Sanders. And so with Bernie Sanders coming along, he really, I think the most powerful thing that he could have done was incite grassroots movements to move and to feel that the work is valid. And I think that what happens in this country specifically is that grassroots movements are given their limelight on TV, in the media for a bit, and then they're sort of turned off, you know what I mean? And then people think that they're not doing anything else. And I think that what happens is, no, they sort of have to just go underground for a bit. I think that there's still a lot of grassroots movements doing a lot of great work, especially when we're thinking about indigenous groups, and we're thinking about environmental groups, Black Lives Matters. All of these movements are still doing the work, even though they're not getting the attention. And I think, unfortunately, in this country, when you want to get some sort of a change to occur, you have to mess with people's money. You have to mess with capital. And I think that that's exactly what grassroots movements do, especially when we're thinking about climate movements, indigenous movements, when they start to do their protests, getting in the way of, like, let's say, fossil fuel projects, and these things take they take longer than what they're supposed to. Banks start to lose money because the projects aren't really falling into the timeline predicted, and so they start to divest. And so I think that right there that's a political way of shifting politics as usual. So that question about what is the far left, what does it look like in America? I think what we're going to see really is a lot more grassroots movements, a lot more movements doing the work, and hopefully getting a lot more limelight, because this has been going on for decades. These groups haven't just started. I mean, even one that I'm very passionate about right now, the Debt Collective, they started from Occupy. Black Lives Matter, started from, have roots in Occupy. And so I think that also the left is something that takes time, and that's what we're seeing, I'll leave it there.
Right. Well, thank you. I like that, how we are attacking, routes of production, and, interfering with deadlines. I love that. That's a great way to just fuck anyone over. And with that, I would like to share that same question with Dustin. Dustin.
Okay. As everyone else said, thank you, Alan, for bringing us on here. And I'll just give some of my thoughts. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is in the age of Trump, I think although that authoritarianism and neo-fascism has become an all-time in the limelight, even though it's always been very apparent since the founding of this nation, I think what I'm seeing differently now, however, is because of its outwardness, it has forced, I think, a shock through the left in a way that has also been the same kind of response on the right, on both extremes. And because of that, I think it's really forced a lot of people to really start making more moves and really start putting out a lot of the realities of what the United States and what citizens who are being oppressed are actually experiencing, especially with the access of technology. People like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, though, as everyone else said, I'm anti-Elizabeth Warren just because I don't believe that she's a real progressive. She's an opportunist. She's a neoliberal. And as much as I supported Bernie Sanders, I also find a bit of problems with his whole entire approach to representing the left. I think that what mistake is that we consolidated all of our faith in a single individual, which is something I think is ideally it would help within the system, but I, for one, just feel that it is, as Talia says, it's all about grassroots. It's all about what groups do in the citizenships, and groups like Black Lives Matter and all these smaller grassroots movements that enable us to start bringing a progressive change into the nation. I think, though, that the main thing that comes to mind, though, is a book comes to my mind, which reminds me, this is called The Wages of Rebellion by Chris Hedges, and how it talks about it's what circumstances that escalate in the most extreme situations is when usually movements start surfacing and start taking greater action. You can see it clear as day with indigenous communities, with fighting against pipelines. And I think that because the stakes are so high, I think that's part of the reason why the left has been starting to really have greater response. COVID has kind of put a monkey wrench in that, though, I think. And at the same time, it's exponentially increased some of the resilience because the circumstances are getting far worse for many people who are living within the margins. And I think that as horrifying all this stuff appears to be, I think it really is going to force radical action, collective radical action, if I might say so. And I think this is all good news, even though it's a tragedy on the other side. But if anything, as history has shown me, and I'm sure for many of you who've read anything in revolutionary, it's that it does take time, but when the time comes, it's usually when people least expect it. If anything, the protests that I saw with what happened in the oh my God, I'm losing Minneapolis, and seeing how internationally there was a response to that. I think it's a prophecy for what's to come. And part of, I think, why there's a fever pitch of neo-fascism in its case is because it has become so corrupt around internationally that I really believe that it's going to force people to be fed up. The only obstacle I can see, though, is our addiction to technology and the distraction of mass media within our technology, the convenience and comfort of capitalism that gives no incentive for us to dive deeper or to have any interest. It creates a mass apathy. However, if anything I've learned from the fall of the Great Berlin Wall, once the television stopped working, that's when the wall fell, because people were forced to really start facing the reality of their situation, which I think COVID is contributing to. But I really think that I think the left really needs to take time and really start taking this time to organize and really push forward to finding actions to shift the consciousness of the nation, but also unite people amidst that.
Oh, thank you very much. That was, thank you. That's leads us right into Mr. Bramble, co-founder of ZQ287. Please, the mic is yours. Sorry, I'm having some issues.
All right, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
All right, perfect. No, yeah, I'll just turn it around and say thank you to you guys for being here. This is our first discussion, and we just sort of like came up with it out of the ether. So, we couldn't have hoped for 3 better people to be on the panel with us. So thank you very much. The way that I would see the far left, just going off of something that Mike said of calling things what they are, I do completely agree that Sanders and Warren, they're definitely lacking in some ways. They're national figures and they're constrained by the whole electoral system. I don't think that there's much need to put all our hopes and faiths, in single figures. I think that's right. But I do think that there's some sort of psychic shift going on in the US definitely at the moment. You can see that in that the far left and the far right are having a moment of, insurgent politics. And I think that in the case of Trump, what he's sort of proved to all of us is that in general, the constituencies of both sides, whether it's only the far left or the far right, or even if that includes the center too, I think that what you can see is that people want a narrative shift in some way. And there are a lot of theories out there about how or why the system has failed them, which we could obviously enumerate here, but I don't think there's a need to. I think we're all pretty familiar with it. I don't know whether a lot of the far right is buying into what Trump says because they see him as the only pathway towards that narrative change. But I think what he demonstrated is that the narrative came first and the policy came second. In general, his administration did very little concretely. For instance, they passed next to no legislation, but they essentially ruled by executive fiat and got a lot accomplished in terms of just a complete recalibration of how people were thinking. And I'm not exactly sure how to translate that to the left, because I see the left as slightly more fractured just because there hasn't been that breakthrough into the highest levels of power yet. So I'm not sure what a kind of like, you know, national spokesperson for the quote unquote left, however you want to see that, would ultimately end up looking like. But I do think that there's some need to establish a narrative for the far left, or establish an identity of some sort. I don't think it necessarily has to be like a unilateral identity. I don't think it even can be, but I do think that there's, you know, a need to, like Talia said, we need to take some sort of action. You know, whether that means that you, and that essentially is messing with the narrative. If one of these figures is to interject themselves between themselves and the capitalist system, the neoliberalist system, I feel like they're going to have to play off of, you know, some power center below them. Kind of like what Dustin said, you know, the power really needs to come from below, and they need to take their cues from below. But I'm not sure, you know, at least for me, I feel a little bit confused when I read the news, when I, you know, do admittedly the very little activism that I do. I feel like it's kind of a bit scattershot between theory and practice and groups and agendas, and sometimes it's hard to see exactly, you know, something that the average person who maybe isn't from the far left would latch on to, that's not this caricature that we're constantly getting out of the news about, you know, all the talking points. Essentially, defund the police is one. I'm not saying that the far left doesn't want that. I want that included, but basically Trump has returned to this red baiting system, and I just wonder what will break through to people who aren't on the far left at the moment. So I'll leave it there.
It's an excellent place to jump on from there. I'll add my opinionated as 2 cents in here. I think there was whispers, and the whispers got loud enough of a party dividing from the Democratic Party, ran by Bernie. Cornel West was talking about this. There's been conversations about this. I think, now I'd like to see politics as a sport. It's the only sport that I pay attention to. So in the sport, what I would like to see is a party splitting from the Democratic Party, threatening the legitimacy of the Democratic Party with some with some celebrity politicians backing that up. Like, you know, we get the squad, and you get Bernie, and you get some, like, what we're considering in the United States, the idea of it being of the progressives. If they separate, create this party that becomes a legitimate threat to the Democratic Party. The reason why the Democratic Party gets so much, has so much power, because all the other parties are not really a threat. The Green Party, any of these other parties, there's no they're not a legitimate threat. They don't really fear them. They pop up every election. They'll say, "Hey, look at us, remember us." They'll throw someone out there saying, "Look at this person." this is who we got running for president, knowing they ain't going to get any actual, like, they're not going to get their money back when it comes for, tax season. That's the thing. Like, they're barely getting their what they put into their campaign back. And knowing that, or hoping for that, the Democratic Party has prospered very well. The only threat they have is the Republicans, and we know what, their game plan is. If we can see the split, it will do as well. And it will make things interesting, because if this new party that comes out from this conversation gets their, play by play from the grassroots operations that are on the ground, disrupting operations, fucking up people's deadlines, having people losing real money, and then not just maintaining just people losing money, but becoming a legitimate threat politically. That's what I think needs to happen. There has to be a legitimate threat to the Democratic Party. And if there's no real threat, the Democratic Party is going to still use the "we are the umbrella" bullshit conversation. You should do for us because, we represent you. They don't represent anyone but someone else's pocket. And we know that. And if we can articulate that, gold-plated and, with a bow on it, that would be great. So with that, I'll leave that from, I'll move on to our next question, which, I hope gets us to, kind of personalize this in our day-to-day, is like, how did Trump and the far right fuck up a coup? Let's ask that. Like, how the fuck did they fuck up a coup? I mean, everything was packaged for them, and they still fucked it up. So I'm going to throw that question straight to Stephen on the other end, start with him, and then we'll see, so Stephen, how do they fuck up a coup?
I guess in my own personal opinion, I mean, they really did that is the goal, it feels like.
They still could have a coup.
I feel like, what?
They could still pull off a coup. I didn't mean to interrupt, but they still have days for pulling off a coup.
They could. I mean, it seems less likely every day, but it seems to me strange that I guess this is the side of the administration that everybody said where it was like there is no 3D chess. They weren't really thinking ahead. They just thought that everything was going to fall in line for them, which I guess they could. It was fair for them to think because, I mean, so much public opinion, it feels like they did just trip over themselves right into success every time with public opinion. People getting more and more radicalized towards Trump's side. And I just think that he didn't think ahead to using the kinds of forces that he probably had at his disposal to work a coup on the ground. Like, for instance, if the military wasn't willing to work with him, we know damn well that the police departments would have worked with him. And that's an equally militarized force in every single community across the US. And we also know that there were plenty of far-right groups that he could have called upon. And I think maybe he just hesitated at that penultimate moment to actually call for the kind of outright show of hard force, hard power that he would have needed to actually steal it.
And I'm gonna now throw that same question. I'm gonna throw the same question to all of you. So just get ready for it. Talia, you're next. I'm seeing you. I know it is late over there, so I want to get your answers while they're still fresh.
Okay. You hear me? Yes.
I can hear you. Yes.
Well, I don't know where that came about, that Trump could pull out a coup. I mean, first of all, you need to be smart to do something like that. He's not. You need to be somewhat of a general. He has no strategy. I don't even think he has the stamina to pull out a coup. You also need the military. And the military, he's in bed with the military. He just finished selling drones to Morocco. I mean, he has been playing really nice with the military. They're like this. So there's no way, from what I know traditionally, a coup to be. I never saw a coup happening here in the United States. We also have to keep in mind that traditionally also coup around any coup d'etat around the world have been also engineered by the United States. So who else is going to intervene here and like make that happen? So no, I mean, Trump has been fattening up the pockets of the wealthiest of the wealthy. I mean, that was really all he wanted, you know, and we're still there. So nobody's going to interrupt that. I mean, that to me, I'm not sure how that came about. I think that these types of conversations about, you know, the Trump as a dictator and, you know, this coup happening, I think that was a scare tactic to get people, you know, to vote. If you were on the fence, you know, especially if you're leaning more towards the left, so you can vote Democratic. But yeah, that was never a thought in my mind that fool could do something like that. I mean, it's not in their benefit at all.
I like that answer because that is an honest answer. Like, this idiot can't wipe his ass right. How will he be able to pull this shit off? You know he has a helper. And now I'm going to throw that same question to Dustin. Dustin, share with us your mind.
I kind of want to piggyback off of what Talia said. I do think that Trump is more of he's a type of politician that depends on the affirmation and affirmation of others. His administration does not give a shit about him. They give a shit more about the opportunities to which he can provide. The man has always been a sleazy real estate businessman, and he's a bully. But much like predecessors like Nixon and Walker Bush, they're all really just wusses. I don't want to use that word, but that's the word that came to mind. And he's just a guy who's trying to make money and get away from the crimes he's committed in the last half century. When I hear the word coup, I mean, to me, it's already happened several times with previous presidents. Illegally won the 2001 election. It's nothing new in American history. It's been going on since the colonial period. And I agree. I think it's just a scare tactic to get people to vote, which I understand. It was effective, you know. But make no mistake, if any coup happened in the United States, it happened a long time ago when this country was bought off by billionaires. And to say that Trump failed the coup, I wouldn't say he failed the coup. I just think he failed to push the agenda he idealized he think he could do, but is too incompetent and inexperienced in politics to actually accomplish that. And his administration takes advantage over that. It's why you got guys like Stephen Miller, who has exacerbated his whole bigotry and racism, even though I think Stephen Miller doesn't actually believe in half the shit he says. I think he just does it because he's a guy who just wants to be an asshole and is just a conservative bigot for the sake of power, not really for actual beliefs and stuff like that. And I think that his administration just really just took advantage. And the reason why this whole entire administration has failed at everything is because it's very hard to conceal the extremes that they are doing without having been completely held accountable for it, and it not being and this is why, again, as I mentioned earlier, why a lot of people are starting to have more radical reactions and action oriented because of the extreme things that they're trying to get away with. To me, his whole administration reminds me of a bunch of boys in a treehouse that are shooting rocks and hurting people, thinking that they get away with it because they've gone away with it their whole lives. But the reality is that it's very difficult once you have the spotlight on you because you're running the fucking world and thinking you're going to get away with this shit all the time. Unlike his predecessor, Obama was able to get away with it because the man had charisma and was able to use the language of neoliberalism, which I think is ultimately more dangerous than neoconservative language, because it's more concealed. And at the same time, I just think that it's just too easy to spot the negative actions of this guy and to just highlight what exactly he might be doing. Now, granted, the disinformation age that we live in makes it a little bit more tricky, but each generation has obstacles like that, and that's just our expression of problems that have existed since, you know, politics have began in this country.
That's some solid shit. Thank you. That's, I mean, you know, we hear on the news constantly, oh, the coup's happening. It's good to have some level-headed human beings calls bullshit. Thank you. Now I'm going to direct that same question to Michael. Michael, what you think? Talk to us. Hold on, Michael. Okay.
Am I unmuted now?
Nope, you're good. Sorry.
Okay, cool. So yeah, good comments by all. I'm pretty much not going to veer too far from what folks are saying here. To be honest, you know, despite some of Trump's, you know, authoritarian leanings and practices, and even some of his demagoguery, yeah, I thought a lot of the coup talk was hyperbolic, to be honest. And that's not to diminish, you know, some of the threats that this man really represents, because I think he did represent something a little bit different in, you know, in that presidential office. If not by substance, at least by style and by rhetoric. You know, you did see some differences there. So I think some of that fear was well warranted. But in terms of a coup and everything that goes into it, I mean, usually when a coup is pulled off, you have to have the ruling class behind you. That's the money people. And, you know, the money people, they kind of played footsie with Trump, you know, throughout his 4 years. They liked the tax breaks. He basically governed like a traditional Republican. It was all tax breaks and deregulation. The guy wasn't a Bonapartist. He's not a military. You know, this isn't Chile in 1971 where, you know, Pinochet is shooting his way to power. Like this, like he's not that. He's not that. And a lot of that is just, as Thalia said, he wasn't capable of it. That doesn't mean that he's not dangerous. I want to, you know, always, you know, say that. But, you know, some of the reasons why I think this thing failed is, I mean, number one, as we just saw in Texas, a day or two ago, I mean, the idea of a judicial coup is done. I mean, the Supreme Court just put a kibosh on it. I mean, I think Trump on his tweeting spree last night and this morning, he was taking shots at two of the most far-right reactionary members of the Supreme Court. That's Uncle Clarence Thomas and Scalia. You know, these are the most far-right people on the Supreme Court. He's absolutely taking shots at them. He was like reaming their asses out. So first off, the judicial branch didn't back any coup because they don't really need it right now. As was mentioned already, he didn't have the military brass behind him. You got to have the military if you're going to pull off a coup. You can't just pull off a constitutional coup and say, "Hey, I'm the president." You got to be able to put some guns and some tanks in the streets. And as we saw, you know, this past summer with the George Floyd rebellion, remember, this is the man who said, you know, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And then he tried to mobilize the military in all these different cities, and there were stories that came out all through the mainstream corporate press that showed that, you know, they basically said, no, you're not about to do this. Even though we shouldn't have any faith in the military and particularly the police, because these are, you know, by nature, these are violent and repressive institutions under capitalism that protect the status quo. But still, they have bounds that they're kind of limited to. So they put the brakes on that. They said, no, you're not going to put the military into Minneapolis and LA and these other cities, although, you know, he didn't need to. We had Democratic mayors and governors who put the damn National Guard in every city anyway. So, and also these, you know, the Proud Boys and the Three Percenters, these kind of auxiliary, you know, fascist, white supremacist groups that are armed, they are dangerous. As we saw in cities like Kenosha, Wisconsin, and some of the street fighting that we've seen in the last few years in places like Berkeley and Portland. But these folks are not the brown shirts, at least not yet. Like I said, that's not to diminish that, you know, the danger, because one lone gunman, as we saw in places like El Paso and a few years ago at that black church down there in South Carolina, you know, that ideology is very deadly. But right now, the fascist forces in this country, they're not a fine-tuned, fighting force that's ready to really get out here and start gunning down the left en masse. I mean, at their height in Charlottesville, they got what, 500 people? Still, I mean, somebody got killed that weekend, but that's far from like a well-heeled fighting force like we saw in Germany and in Italy in the last century, where you saw legitimate fascist movements that were able to step into the streets and crush labor unions and also crush the left. So I'll stop it there. I don't think the material conditions existed for Trump to pull off a coup.
Excellent. Now this leads us well to our last question for the evening. Given the authoritarian leanings of the far right, how can the far left speak to the far right honestly and compassionately? I personally honor Chairman Fred Hampton's modalities and practice in which we must speak to those who we have similarities with. The politics that divide us is illusionary at best. And you and I suffer the same fucking master assholes who's fucking me over, who's fucking you over, and let's put our vengeance aside for another day and fuck these guys over.
Yeah.
I think this is vastly important to discuss because the enemy of my enemy is my ally. I'm not looking for these guilt tier allies, like I feel guilty. No, I need people who are like, you suffer like I suffer. We know who's making our suffering happen. So with that being open, I'm going to start with Talia and ask her, what's your opinions on it? Being that you deal with debt, personally, how many of us suffer through debt, and how that has very little racial profile. But it does have a racial profile, but
no, it has debt has a very big racial profile. No, but this idea of, you can hear me, right?
yes.
This idea of compassion and how the left speaks with compassion to the right. I think if we take my idea of, I see the left not so much as a party within the government, but the left as grassroots movements. I think the movements themselves is a way of us speaking with compassion. To me, a movement in struggle not only tells a story of why we're struggling against, it presents historically why this is happening. I also see grassroots movements as a way of saying with compassion, I will not be fucked over anymore. This is the reason why. Will you join me? And so for me, in many ways, it is very important to shift, I guess, to take what Stephen was saying, to shift.
We can't hear you. Okay.
You just muted me.
Sorry, I'm having problems with this
Okay.
machine here. Sorry about that.
Did you hear what I said, the whole thing, or do I need to say?
Go back 2 minutes.
What did you last hear?
I heard compassion. What do you do for me? Why should I join you?
Oh, okay. So yes. So as a movement presents itself, movement in struggle, grassroots movements in resistance, I think all of that, what they represent is history, why there is this struggle historically, and also a way to say, will you join me? When people join other groups, you don't just join blindly. You join because you either hear the story and you say, holy shit, this happened historically, this is why you're doing it, I'm going to fight with you. And so we're not necessarily becoming missionaries and getting people to come to our side. No, they're listening to the story of why we're fighting against our oppression, why we're in this struggle. And hopefully that us in resistance is enough for some to create allyship. I mean, for me, I see grassroots movements as sort of like very compassionate way, actually, of saying, I'm through with you fucking me over. Because especially during the summer with the murders of Black and people of color by the police, many times we saw activists say, be happy that the only thing we're doing is protesting. And not doing something else. So right there, for me, I think I was trying to retake what Stephen was saying about shifting the narrative of what compassion is. I am not looking to perpetuate the idea of the savior as this compassionate form of compassion. I'm not here to say, you hit me on one cheek, I'm going to offer you the other one. No, this is not my idea of compassion. I'm not here. I feel that this idea of, oh, let's talk. I'm going to go to you so you can understand me. Let's meet at the middle. I think that we do that already without having to actually do that. We do that by continuing to organize, continuing to bring to the surface our oppressions, meeting people. That's how we meet people in the middle. That's how we shift mind frames. I think that's actually what I feel is so big right now. This is the shift that we're talking about that's happening in this country, that all of a sudden there's just more of us, right? There's more of us joining groups in struggle. There's more of us saying, holy shit, I didn't know that happened. There's more of us getting educated. And when I mean educated, I mean by these movements, enough mainstream education, enough capitalist education. We're talking about radical education. And so, yeah, this idea of compassion, I feel that actually it has always existed in what I'm terming the left, because like a lot of activists said, I mean, the right needs to be feeling lucky that we're not doing something worse than just protesting. And I'm not necessarily also anti-violence. I mean, that's not the first thing I go for. But if you're going to come at me and my family and my friends, I'm not going to sit there and give you my other cheek. So.
Yes, don't fuck with us. We fuck back. And the fact that we need new authors for this narrative that we're speaking of. We need, and hopefully you are that author. I'm speaking to the many of so, or maybe 5 people that's listening to this. But now with that, thank you. I'm going to give the baton to Dustin. Please share with us your mind.
I think for me, it is a matter of compassion, but also understanding where, whom, and how that compassion is practiced, and how do we build bridges for understanding, as opposed to debating what is true. To me, it's more about what our experiences have been and finding those commonalities, rather than always talking about, well, it's because of this, because of that. I think that is part of it, but from what I've seen with people who have come from either more conservative backgrounds or have come from a lot more of that right-wing ideology, I think what happens is because we live in such a polarized time where people are more emotionally invested in their beliefs and values, as opposed to developing a conversation. And it's done that by design, with the polarity of social media projecting politics in such a way that is extreme and also disingenuous. And I think for me, what it is finding ways on how we can build bridges by providing to those a way of maybe starting the conversation. I think when people's needs are being met in such a way, or when people's experiences are shared and not compared, I think that begins the conversation of developing an understanding. The hard part is, though, because I think, as Talia was pointing out, with radical education, I think that is a key component to it, because I think most people don't know because they don't want to know, because they're too afraid to know, and it just validates their experience because it's being compared to somebody else as being worse, or, well, you're not as oppressed as I am. And though it may be true, it's the last thing, especially with people at the bottom, want to hear, because they already are denying their in many cases, especially with white working class people or impoverished white people who are MAGA fanatics, tend to just ignore reality altogether because of all the different walls of reality that has disconnected them from what's actually causing the problem. And I think that because of that, there's a wall between different classes in America, ethnically and racially, and it creates, I think, a chaotic dysphoria between them, because between all people, because everyone's focusing on who's right, as opposed to what has your experience been like, where can we draw from that together. And I wanted to also agree with Alan with the idea we have to take the Hampton approach to it by empowering all people together, and kind of almost like figuring out what is your experience, and finding those commonalities. And then from there, I think once we have that understanding, like, you did go through the same experience, it's just in a different way, instead of saying, well, this is worse and mine's worse than this. And it is true. But I think in order to really reach people who are on the extreme right, you have to validate not entirely what they believe, but maybe perhaps their experience and why and what led them to believe that. And hopefully through that conversation and having an understanding of talking together and finding out what are those common grounds that we can find to point out what is actually causing this issue for both of us, I think that's all I have. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I'm going to now give the baton over to Stephen. Stephen, mic is yours.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Dustin just said. As far as, there are a lot of worlds set inside of this nation, this country, whatever you want to call it. Obviously, we're grappling with a caste system that we all want done away with. And it would be nice to just wipe our arms across the board and get rid of it completely. But I think that, unfortunately, that's where the cynical side of at least myself comes out when, I mean, I spent the last 4 years trying to take Trump seriously just because, I do think, obviously, he's an idiot. Obviously, he's a fool. Obviously, the ways that his followers think is inconsistent and not a logical progression. But the problem is that I feel like he unlocked ideology to its most dangerous degree. And there was starting to be or maybe even is continuing to be, a sort of crossover appeal even to people who are on the losing end of a caste system, where, it's obviously a convenient smokescreen for him to say that, like, we're just a capitalistic system. We just want everybody to come in and we all want everybody to participate on the same level. And that's where you start to see some of the, like, flirtation with, figures that may have crossover appeal into, like, the black and brown community, like, for instance, Ice Cube and Kanye and all these, figures that kind of, like, crossed the line and tried to say, tried to take him at his word and to say that, well, yes, this neoliberalist system did lock us up. We are in prison. The situation couldn't possibly be worse. And so what do we have to lose, as he said, somewhat famously? What do you have to lose by crossing the line and trying to come over here and work with me? I mean, you already say it on the far left that you're already under a dictatorship. There were already coups that happened long ago. Why don't you step into this one and try this reality on for size? And you did start to see some people cross that line. And the cynical side of me is that, there's so many people that don't base their understanding of politics on politics at all. It's really just, it's a TV culture. It's an internet culture too. I mean, the two might as well be, interchangeable. It's just people get a extremely dumbed down version of it. And that version of it is legitimized by the people at the top. And, that's what scares me about it, is power is power is power. You can be an idiot and be in power. I personally don't think that Hitler was a particularly intelligent person. The man was a flat out racist. And, I mean, not to make that comparison, but you get what I mean. It's like this is the most extreme example. It's like, you don't have to be an intelligent person to be a good politician. Now, to be a good to be good at governance, to be good at administration, sure. But it bothers me that, there seems to be, like, in this TV culture, is the left getting, how do we reach across to people who are completely outside that world? We want to pull them into this world of, like, identity politics and imperialism and caste systems and all these terms that, like, part of me, I would prefer if we were always living there as a society. But on the other hand of it, it's like, it's very hard to talk to these people in those kinds of terms. And so I don't know that I have an answer to the question exactly. I just know that whenever I try, like, I like being around my circle because I can talk in the terms that I want to talk in. But when you talk about this kind of stuff with people outside the circle, it can be extremely hard to win a debate unless you are keyed into something else, unless you're keyed into the society at large. And so I'm not exactly sure how to merge those two, but that's kind of what I think.
Fascinating. Michael Brown, would you like to take us home?
Yeah, I'll definitely chime in. Again, good comments from all on this. I think the thing about a big question like this is, I don't think there's necessarily one answer or one framework. I think it's a variety of things. I'm really happy to hear the Fred Hampton references here, because I think that work that he was beginning to do, and I think ultimately what got him assassinated was, building across racial lines, but anchoring the politics, in class, while not, giving short shrift to things like race and people's upbringing. I think in this country, this is not a homogenous population, or this isn't like Western Europe or Eastern Europe where, you had social democratic parties and, they could have things like communist parties and socialist parties because they didn't have McCarthyism. And if you understand American history, you know that McCarthyism went hand in hand with counterattacks against, the civil rights movement and the Black Power movements as well. So we got a bigger hill to climb in this country because we got to understand the dialectics between race and class. We have to understand that they can't be separated. But in terms of how do you talk to the far right on these issues, I think that one of the geniuses of Fred Hampton, and the reason he was able to talk to, dirt poor whites in Appalachia and, in those parts of Chicago, who comprised the Young Patriots, they were talking about class, and a lot of those folks are working side by side in the same factories and getting shit wages alongside blacks and Latinos and Native Americans. And the one thing that they all had in common is that they were all being screwed by the same person or the same entities, the same capitalist ruling class. So while I don't think there's a panacea to this question, there's not like a one word answer, I still think class solidarity is a great point to start. And it can't just be some abstract class solidarity. It has to be solidarity in the workplace. And also, I think in the social movements that we build, you know, at the grassroots level from below, they have to present alternatives. This is why I'm really big on, you know, us. We have to break away from the Democratic Party. Because right now, you know, we're just in this hamster wheel, and what happens with demagogues and figures like Donald Trump, and unfortunately, you know, a more dangerous version of Donald Trump, maybe 4 years down the line, is the political center, which is represented by the likes of, you know, the Barack Obamas and the Joe Bidens. These people do nothing but immiserate the conditions that drive people into the arms of folks like, you know, Donald Trump, you know, who don't have any answers either, but, you know, they can play upon fake populism, and they can play into just, you know, worse sort of base instincts of people, you know, around issues of xenophobia and anti-immigration. And, you know, a lot of people voted for Trump on, you know, building a wall, and he didn't even build the damn wall. Not that I was for it, but it was like, I would love to have a conversation with all of those people and just point out the contradictions. You know, and they can't say that, you know, well, you're just a liberal talking. No, I don't support Biden either, because he ain't gonna do shit about these problems either. Let's talk about what these real problems are and how do we get to real solutions. And I think we should always try to engage with people who are willing to engage in good faith. I don't necessarily agree that my enemy is my ally. I think there is a part of the far right that I talked about a little bit earlier, you know, folks who are out in the streets with arms and shit like that. No, we don't need to be building with them. But that's not most of Trump's supporters. He got 70 million votes in this last election, but I think it's important to point out that, you know, 80 million people, you know, voted against that. So it's not like he enjoys a consensus, but that's still a lot of people. And we can't just afford to write that many people off. Although there are sections of that group that, I don't know, can we engage them? You may not be able to, but I don't agree that it's the vast majority of them. So I think you got to build where you can and engage with people who are willing to engage in good faith and you know, just see where things fall. But right now, I think, you know, in terms of the left, if that's the number one topic on the agenda, I think right now we have to try to galvanize and build our forces up, and then we can start to project. Because that's what every social movement in the history of this country did, from the populist movement to the civil rights movement to women's suffrage. None of them were popular. There were far rights in those days, and you know what? People chipped away at them. They were able to win at least a critical mass of people over. They couldn't win everybody, but they won a critical mass. And, you know, they were able to make some progressive, you know, economic and social changes. So I'll leave it there. And but that's a great question. It's something that every activist and organizer should be thinking about.
Yes, I'm very honored to have such an array of articulated, minded, historically grounded panel to help us view the angles in which our main purpose is that if none of us are free, if none of us are free, no one is free. If someone is not free, that is our job, to make sure that our job is to free them. That's a personal philosophy. I feel the conversation when we were trying to discuss, when I mentioned the enemy of my enemy is my ally, I wanted to ground that is that many people's personal enemy is poverty. Well, not many people want to admit that they're poor. They're part of this Hollywood media television culture that you and I, millennials, Generation X, have all been bombarded with advertisement and constant television that has modeled our morals and our cultural understanding. And all of them has said that poverty is wrong, and dear God, you should do everything in your power to not be poor and not to associate with being poor. And a lot of us internally avoid that real honesty. And if we could get people to admit to them, let's say you and I are suffering in a way that we know that suffering. And that connection alone says, now that we know how we are suffering together, there is a mechanism, a group, a caste, a group of fuckers that need to get fucked back. How do we fuck the right fuckers? How do we become a fucking threat that you're too scared to kill us, but you will negotiate with us? You give us room. You let us exist, or else there would be dire consequences. And I'm not even talking about physical violence. I'm talking about shit that makes you piss yourself in the middle of the night.
Mm-hmm.
I want to shake your soul. I want you to be so fucking scared of us that you have no way to you cannot live without us.
Right.
And with that being said, thank you, all those 5 or 7 people that are watching this. This is ZQ287. We're a panel of opinionated fuckfaces, and hopefully we'll see your ass again. Good day, good night, and fuck off.